Hey guys, welcome to Irish Medieval History, and today I have a really important guest, and that's Kevin from the Brehon Academy. Kevin, thank you so much for coming onto the live stream today. It means so much to me, to be quite honest with you, because as a lot of people know, for a good few years now, I've been doing my best to try to promote Irish medieval history as much as possible. And very early on, just like the Celtic Templar, you yourself have done your best to try to promote Irish medieval history as best as you can. And you've done an absolute amazing and wonderful job promoting Irish medieval. It's true, like you have promoting Irish medieval history on YouTube. So, Kevin, thanks so much for coming on today.
Well, Philip, I'm delighted to be here. I don't consider myself very important, but I'll take the compliments. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to having this conversation with you and your audience.
Oh, nice, nice. So when it comes down to the Brehon law, at times it can be very, very complicated to kind of navigate and make your way through. And early on, you pretty much promoted my class over on Patreon, where I discussed the very basics of Irish medieval history. However, over on the Brehon Academy, you promote the Brehon laws. What exactly is it you do over there?
That's a really good question. I I do a bit of everything, to be honest. You know, I'm writing blog articles. I have 3 online courses that people may want to check out. They're on early Irish culture and society, Irish mythology, and Brehon law. And I originally set out to do the Brehon law course, but as I started working on the Brehon law course, you know how it goes. I realized that people don't know what Brehon law is. And in order for them, I wanted to create a way that people would care about the Brehon laws. And so I had to create the Irish culture and society course first. That's quite extensive. And then the mythology course is the kind of a bridge to get to the Brehon law course, because there's a lot of Brehon law even in the Irish mythology, you know. And the reason why I love Brehon law, well, I have a law degree, just so people are aware of that.
You're not just a lunatic.
I'm not
You're
just
actually
a
qualified lunatic.
Exactly, I'm a qualified lunatic. And I was kind of into Brehon law before I went to university to study law, because I had heard about it. And when I first heard about it, can you imagine how I felt when I just thought there was law? I didn't realize that there was different types of law. And like I found out that there's a such thing as like common law, and I was like, okay, that's interesting. But then I found out that there's a Brehon law, which is older than the common law, and it's kind of like the Irish common law. And the reason why we call it Brehon law is because Brehon comes from the Irish word for a judge, which is 𝗵𝗶, but the Irish never called it that. They didn't call it that. They weren't saying like, oh, this is Brehon law. It's just what we call it today because it's gone through Anglicization and we're looking at it through a historical lens.
It's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Especially like, because I remember we were having a private discussion a while back, and also we were discussing as well on your video for your channel as well, how we have not just an interpretation from our own modern interpretation today, which to be honest, which is kind of incorrect slightly, especially from a nationalist perspective, but also on top of that as well, even people during the medieval era, let's say the late medieval period, where we have this kind of Anglo-Irish interpretation of what happened during the early medieval period, that interpretation may be incorrect and wrong. So it's quite interesting that you bring that up, that not only do we have to study this, but kind of put ourselves in the shoes of the people of the early medieval era.
Exactly, and that's a good point. So what the Irish would have called it, well, it depends on who it was applying to, because the Irish were called 𝗵𝗍. The Irish, like farmers, were called 𝗵𝗍, you know, and so there was a body of law called the Fenechas, and that's where the 𝐶𝐤𝐻 that you mentioned on my channel, that's where that would come in. It would be under the body of law called the Fenechas. There was also the Brehon na Méid, which is the judgment of the nobles, and that would apply to the class of people to which were nobles, okay, and there was also such thing as like the canon law, you know. So it depended on the type of community that you were interacting with, what law would apply. And the role of the Brehon was to study these laws. And I should say that before writing was, you know, a big thing in Ireland, the Brehon had to learn these laws by memory. And that's where you have the poetry, like the judgments were always given in the form of poetry. And that was a mnemonic device to remind them of, well, when this happens, then this is the judgment, you know. And that's probably, I would assume that's why they used poetry, just to kind of trigger that memory, because they were memorizing like massive amounts of information. And here's the thing. when the Brehon was speaking, when he was given his judgment, there was a reverence for it, because it was perceived to be sacred. It was perceived to be a sacred act, that almost like a priest. And that's interesting, because when you go further back in time, at a certain point, there was Brehons, there was Fili, and there was Druids. But when you go further back in time, like before we had writing, that office was held by one man, and that man was the Druid. So it makes sense that the Irish were let's call them the Gaels. They were perceiving the administration of law as a sacred act, and that's why they felt compelled to follow it, because there was no enforcement mechanism in Ireland. There was no way to, if the family didn't want to, you know, abide by the law, there was no really way for forcing them to do that, except for outlawry, which means that you would lose the protection of the law that you had shunned yourself as a man, and that means you could be treated like an animal, which meant you could be killed, right? So you lost the protection of the law. And there's like so much more I could go into this. You can probably see I'm getting animated now.
Yeah. Because
there's so much more I could go into this, but yeah, let's just see where the conversation goes.
Because now you're going into because straight away my military brain is starting to kick off there, and I could easily go on to a rant as well. But originally we actually planned to talk about kingship in Ireland, so we have a list of questions here that I want to poke and prod and annoy you with, to be quite honest with you, especially this opening question of the laws of the kingship in early medieval Ireland. Tell me, what were the Dorfin? Is it pronounced Dorfin or Dorfin?
Derfina.
So for the
Derfina. And what that means is the true kin.
Oh, the true kin.
The true kin, and that okay. So I think I can just pick up and start talking. There was three different, maybe four, but there was essentially three core family units in early Ireland. There was the Derfina, there was the Gelfina, and there was an 𝐼rfina. And the Derfina meant your true kin, which included all of your siblings and relatives from a common grandfather. Now, why is that interesting? Because in today's time, we don't consider the grandparents to be the immediate family. We don't consider it to be the nuclear family. But in those times, they did. Their consciousness was, my family is everybody who is related to my grandfather. Okay, and that means like their brothers and sisters and their children and so on and so forth. So you can imagine that unit would grow to quite significant number. Then the Gelfina was all of your great grandparents, your great grandfather's siblings, their children and their children, right? And you're just there at the middle, you know. So it's from you looking up. And then the 𝐼rfina was the afterkin, which was your great grandparents. And so you can imagine, right? Just conceptualize this now. You're looking at your 𝐼rfina as this, you know, a great grandfather, and it's a big circle. But that's only from your perspective. You mentioned on the previous conversation that society was knitted together, the families were knitted together, and it was quite complicated. Well, the point is that I'm trying to make is that, what about your grandfather's 𝐼rfina? What about your grandfather's Gelfina? So, or his brother's 𝐼rfina and his, like, you know, siblings' 𝐼rfina. I'm sorry I keep mentioning the men, but it was patrilineal, okay? That was the way society tended to work. But the female had importance, like the females were important as well. So how did this system influence royal succession? Well, the king, which we call a king today because Anglo brain, but they were called Ri or chieftain or Taoiseach, and they were elected from within the Derefine. So every Derefine had the clan, and the leader of the clan was called the O'Neill, the O'Flanagan, the McCarthy, right? Or the O'Carty, the McCarthy Moore, the O'Neill Moore. Which means, for those who don't know, it's like the big O'Neill or the great O'Neill or the great Flanagan and so on. And that was a way that they could, elect a leader from within themselves. And that was the thing as well. There was no divine right to rule in early Ireland. It was done through election. And if you wanted to be elected, you had to get the favor of all of the families in your tribe, right? And that created this very interesting kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Balance of power, let's say. Where you had to keep those families happy and you had to be a good king.
That's fascinating. And tell me, how did the concept of the ruler's truth, legalize a king's authority? How did that work?
Okay, so I believe you're talking about 𝐵 Fleadhimon here. And what's interesting about that is you said the ruler's truth, and that is how it's interpreted. But the word fla means noble, and so it's actually like noble truth, the truth of a noble man. And that was a way to distinguish yourself as a good ruler, is that you would have what we would call today the judgment of King Solomon, but back then they would call 𝐵 Fleadhimon the judgment of a nobleman. So that's one way that the king could legitimize himself, because I mentioned that the Irish viewed law and the administration of law as a sacred act. Well, if you go far enough back, that king was also the high priest. That king was the officiate at ceremonies, at civil ceremonies, okay? And so he had this kind of semi-sacred, semi-divine role. And if he was a good king, then the crops, this is what they believed, the crops would grow, there'd be peace in the land, he'd win all of his battles, But if he was a bad king, the crops would fail, okay? So that's how the concept of 𝐵 Fleadhimon, the judgment of the nobleman, the truth of a nobleman, legitimized the king's authority.
That's fascinating. Geez, you really are packed with a whole load of information, to be quite honest with you. You were mentioning about the role of women just a moment ago. Let's elaborate more on the role of women within kingship. What role did women play within the sovereignty? What did they do there?
This is a great question. And you know what? I meant to say, I could tell you a story that illustrates this previous point, the 𝐵 Fleadhimon, if you want to. But let's just focus on the women for now. Okay, so it's interesting because Ireland is called Iru, and that's after a goddess, okay? And there's other ways she's referred to. I say she because I think of Ireland as a woman. She's referred to in poetry, which is Bamba and Fola. They're two different goddesses, but they're usually depicted as three sisters. And we call Ireland Iru today because of Iru, right? But it's all the island is also referred to as Bamba and Fola in poetry. And so, why is that important? Because the Banflaw, this is the same word that I was mentioning a moment ago, Fleadhimon, the Banflaw, it's a female noble, okay? And it's basically another word for a lady or a queen. And because the land was a goddess and it was seen to be a goddess, and you're the king, you had to have a sacred marriage to the land. You had to do a ceremony that you basically vowed to be the protector, to be the husband, to be the provider of your people, which was symbolized through this marriage to the land.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. God, I could really elaborate still further on that, especially with the role of the church and stuff. Perhaps maybe for a different discussion and stuff. But for the time being, why was, and this is kind of going a completely different direction now, but tell me, why was the Hill of Tara the symbol for Irish kingship in Ireland? Why was that?
Yeah, that's a good question. How can I approach it? There was previously four provinces. There was okay. When Ireland was first divided, it was divided into Heber's half and Heremond's half. Okay, that was the first division of Ireland, according to the mythology. Okay, but there was a time when it had 5 provinces, and Meath was the 5th province, and Meath was considered the middle kingdom. Okay, and you had the Ó'hAodha, the Ulster, you had Connacht, you had the Munster men, and you had the Lagan, the Leinster men. But Meath occupied this role in the psyche of Irish men and Irish women, Irish people, that the King of Tara was also the King of Ireland. Now, that's how it's come down to us in the mythology, right? When you look at the deeper archaeological and historical facts, it doesn't seem that there was ever a time, but maybe there was. Maybe like you have 𝗵𝗵𝗀, you have the well, I was going to say Niall of the Nine Hostages, but I don't think he was in Tara. You only have these like short moments in Irish history where you could say the island was united under a single king. But even at that, when you get into the granular details of it, it's like there was Vikings fighting with 𝗵𝗵𝗀 against the Vikings of Dublin, and there was Irish clans with the Vikings of Dublin fighting against 𝗵𝗵𝗀. So it's not really right to think of, Tara in that way, where the King of Tara was basically also the King of Ireland, because it was always in opposition. It was always held in opposition.
I think the problem really does arise with our interpretation of centralization to do with the kingship. The magic of 𝗵𝗵𝗀, and why 𝗵𝗵𝗀 is so magical, is because from the get-go, 𝗵𝗵𝗀 had a Charlemagne Hiberno education from around the area of Kerry. So 𝗵𝗵𝗀 was bringing in, like, he literally refers to himself, and me and Bertie now have had a good few live streams where we have, because Bertie's spent years, he even put together a script and a movie, and he's written books countlessly on 𝗵𝗵𝗀. And what blows everyone's mind is the fact that this guy is not referring to himself as ardria, he's not referring to himself as any form of over kingship like previous people before him. He's referring to himself as Emperor of the Scotti. And so he's very much in line with the Charlemagne court. And with that, he's bringing in these centralized identity. Because we've had, some forms of ardria before with the likes of Mael Shocknall I or Flanagan, or even perhaps within Donegal, depending on your interpretation of what is a high kingship. However, the problem is that these people come in and they bring in a very early medieval version of kingship into Ireland. So it is very interesting that you do bring up 𝗵𝗵𝗀 and 𝗵𝗵𝗀's interpretation of centralization that fits in more of with our modern interpretation of what is kingship. So it does get much more complicated, especially when we have a society that, perhaps we don't need a king. If society's knitted in, and this is definitely where your interpretation is very important, because you've gone the extra mile when it comes down to,
does Ireland need a king? I would say that well, they had a king. They had a king. Whether they needed it or not, that's definitely something to think about. I would say probably for the time and the way Irish society and culture seemed to work, my reading of it, is that a king was very necessary in order to basically, be kind of a dictator or something like that, because the Vikings were here for many hundreds of years. Brian Boru's mother actually married into the Viking royal family of Dublin, right? So it was a very complicated situation. But if there was no Brian Boru, the Vikings would probably still be here. Do you know what I mean? So I think that he served a necessary purpose during the Viking Age anyway. So yeah, I don't know if they needed a king, but it seemed that a king was necessary in order to push the Vikings back.
Yeah, yeah. You definitely are coming at it from the same kind of interpretation that Bertie came at it last week, where if Brian Boru didn't stamp out Sihtric, the king of Dublin at the time, then it definitely would have opened the gate to the Danish king coming in, because, the king of Denmark, he had taken the crown of the Kingdom of England in 1016. So it is possible. Now, I have a completely different interpretation to both yourself and Bertie, but it is interesting that you do bring in the idea that if Sihtric was allowed to continue this kind of independent, not giving tribute to the King of Ireland, Brian Boru, therefore it could have led to the opening of the King of Denmark coming in and then starting to really shake things up in Ireland. So I do find that to be a very interesting interpretation as we enter into the High Middle Ages, where we're not dealing with separate groups anymore. At least in Ireland it was somewhat knitted in, but to a degree, Ireland needed bigger centralization going on, and thank God we had Brian Boru at the time. Sadly, we didn't have Brian Boru later on, who could have really was the hammer in there. And the poor O'Connors were the closest things we had to a king, a centralized rule on the Ireland, and they just couldn't control what our barons were up to at the time. But we could talk all day and bitch all about all that all night, to be honest with you. And it kind of leads into my next question there of how did Brehon law define the responsibilities of the area king towards his own people?
Yeah. Well, this kind of throws back to what I was saying before about the 𝗵𝗺, and like, what is the quality of a good king, and what was his responsibility? And this probably addresses the previous question that you were asking, like, do we even need a king? Well, do people need to be protected? Do they need to have a leader? Do they need to have a protector? Somebody who upholds the laws, a protector of the law? I would say yes. And so I would define the responsibilities of a king as the same way that I would define the responsibilities of a husband to his family, or to a warrior to his people, and so if the king didn't behave, if he wasn't a good king, well, then it would show up with, like I said before, the crops failing, the people would overthrow him because he needed the support of all of his clans, all of the clans, because they were knitted together, So, yeah, that's what I would say to that question. How did the Brehon law define the responsibilities of a king? I would say much like the way we define the responsibilities of a husband to his wife and a warrior to his people.
But then, what were the consequences for a king who failed to uphold his taboos or what he wasn't prohibited to do?
Yeah, the consequences. Well, this is the thing, right? I'm given a very kind of straightforward interpretation of the laws, okay? But the thing is, just because the laws exist doesn't mean that society actually operated in that way.
Yeah.
So the laws are more aspirations for how did the society view themselves, and how would they like to be, how would they like society to operate in an ideal situation. So I'm sure that there was kings who were not very good, who the people were powerless to do anything about it. That's just the reality. That's just the reality of the time, of the nature of kingship and the nature of power. Now, there is also some supernatural elements. Like, we have mythology of like kings getting blemishes, the crops failing. I mentioned that already, but you could see physical blemishes on a king. And in the Brehon law, there was an old law that said a king cannot be king while he's blemished. A blemished man could not be the leader of the people, because that man was supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be the figurehead and the representative of the 𝐿t𝐻𝐻, of the 𝐿𝐻𝐻, of the tribe, of the clan. And I know you don't really like the word tribe, but
yeah, not a fan of it whatsoever.
And that, okay, so that takes us back to like mythology, right? Of the 𝐿𝐻𝐻 Danu, right? Which some people say means the tribe of the goddess Danu, but I don't know if I believe that. I think it's more like 𝐿𝐻𝐻 Dana, which is like the civilized, like the 𝐿𝐻𝐻 is the tribe, the Day is the gods, like the priests, and the Dana is the poets. So there's that way to interpret it as well. And when you have the first battle of Moitora between the Fomorians and the 𝐿𝐻𝐻 Danan, 𝐏𝐻𝐻 loses his arm, and he gave up the kingship because he was blemished. And it wasn't until the children of 𝐴𝐻𝐸𝐾t, I can't remember their names, there was a man and a woman. First, 𝐴𝐻𝐸𝐾t restored his fleshy arm, but then the children of 𝐴𝐻𝐸𝐾t gave him a silver arm, and that's where we get 𝐏𝐻𝐻𝐻 𝐼𝐻𝐸𝐿.
That's quite fascinating. Right?
Yeah, 𝐏𝐻𝐻𝐻 𝐼𝐻𝐸𝐿, and then he was able to reclaim the kingship, and that's when Llŷ arrives on the scene, and he's such a great man that he 𝐏𝐻𝐻𝐻 hands over the kingship to him to lead them in the second battle of Moitora, also against the Fomorians. Oh no, sorry, he lost. Let me rephrase that. He lost his arm in the battle with the 𝗵𝗵𝗀, and it was in the second battle of Moitora when that was the first battle of Moitora. In the second battle of Moitora, it's against the Fomorians, and Llŷ Ó'hAodha Samaldonach led the 𝐿𝐻𝐻𝐻 Danan in that battle. So I think that if you can make a broad stroke view of all of the information that existed there, including the mythology, including the historical record and the manuscripts, and you can kind of draw from that. Well, I draw my own conclusions from that, which is how did the king suffer the consequences? I would say it's supernatural, it's physical, and it was not always able to be fulfilled. Let's say that you couldn't like forcibly remove the king if he was more powerful than you. But there's also things in the law that would give the weaker party power over the stronger party. And what am I talking about there? There's a thing called Trosgood, okay, and that was a ritual of fasting. And so you would fast outside the home of a wealthy man or a noble, and if he ate during that time, you would get double the fine. So it was a way for you to put pressure on and bring this social awareness, like this, the awareness of the community. And you would probably sit outside the let's say the noble's house from dawn till dusk, and he couldn't eat while you were outside there. Now he could eat at night time, fair enough, but that wasn't the point. The point was you were doing something that created a social shame that brought attention to this man. And I didn't mention that, but reputation was everything back then. If you're living in these small little tight-knit communities, then reputation was extremely important. And if the noble didn't like comply or ate while you were fasting outside the house, the fine doubled. So that was another way that was one way that you could like put pressure on a noble to comply with his responsibilities and so on. Yeah,
absolutely fascinating, and it's very interesting from my perspective as well, especially when I go through the literature looking at it from a very military perspective of why you had these 𝐼𝐻 kings who were leading from the front, but then when they get the advantage over other kings, then they're trying to mutilate each other. You know, you have very disturbing descriptions of what kings are trying to do to another, even going as far. I remember Kevin Moore once, I turned around and I found one part where, you know, they were trying to remove the eye, and Kevin turned around and says, it doesn't always mean the eye. Sometimes from a Byzantine influence, they may be trying to remove the penis. And I was there looking at this going, oh, okay. The whole idea of, you know, undermining someone else's kingship to that point was absolutely wild. But now that you highlight to me the importance of kingship, it really goes to show why they were trying to mutilate each other on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Tell me this, just going back into the foundations now, how did the process of 𝐼𝐸 work? How did they elect a 𝐼𝐸? How did that all work?
We don't have it written down in manuscripts, okay? But it was only the people who were called 𝐼𝐸, which means like kingly material or kingly earth, let's say, because down is earth or world, who were eligible to vote in these elections. And I mean, how I would imagine it would work is that you would have an assembly and only those like men who are eligible to be elected as king. It would work a little bit like electing a new pope, in that you'd have a conclave and only the bishops could go into the conclave, and they would have discussions, and then soon or eventually somebody would be elected on consensus, and maybe if there's somebody else who wanted it, there would be a discussion, and you'd keep discussing until there was an agreement on that. Now, how did you prevent disputes in the event of the king's death? And that's where the Taoiseach comes in. So for those who are like maybe American, or you're wondering why do we call our Prime Minister the Taoiseach and the Deputy Prime Minister the Taoiseach, it goes directly back to this concept in early Ireland. So the Taoiseach was basically the king's second in command, and they were also elected. Probably, I would assume, often during this main election, but maybe the king would appoint the Taoiseach, or who he would like to be the Taoiseach, as the successor in the event of his death, and or if he had to go away on business or something like that, and the Taoiseach stayed behind, the Taoiseach would be in command.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. There's another thing as well that really does confuse me. What's the Stone of Destiny, and how does that work, and why is that so important? Because I know a lot of people go on about, you know, the Stone of Tara and these other stones left, right, and center around the place. Like, what are these things, and why are they so important?
Well, let me just start by saying that the stone that's on the Hill of Tara now, I don't think is the original Stone of Destiny.
It's not.
Right? No, it's not. No, it's not. At least that's my understanding of it, because I actually think the Stone of Destiny is under the coronation chair of the royal family in England. Yeah. But that's probably more in depth than I'd like to get into. But let's just say it this way: that there's some legend that a king of Scotland, and I should say that Scots were also Irish. Okay, we were originally Scots, and we apparently come from Queen Scotia, right, who was an Egyptian princess or something like that. She emigrated over here, and her people became the Scots, and then we emigrated through 𝐷𝐴 to the west of Scotland, and that's how they became eventually Scotland, because previously to that it was called Alba, or Pictland, the land of the Picts. And do you know that the oldest stone circle is on Orkney Island? So I'm starting to like play with the idea that, like, what if our culture came from Orkney to Ireland, you know, like the stone circles, because the oldest stone circle known to man is found on the Orkney Islands, and that was where the Pictish people originated. That's where they dwelled, let's say. And there's no clear event in history where, like, there was no Scots completely massacred the Picts. So what we can assume from that is that there was a gelling together of these two peoples. All the kings of the Milesians must be enthroned using the Stone of Destiny. And a Scottish king, he requested permission to, bring the stone to Scotland, but it never came home. It was basically seized by English king and brought to Westminster to get crowned to be the next king or queen. And for a long time, it was under that chair. Now they don't think it's under the chair anymore because there's another highly likely that Scottish nationalists went and stole that stone back, and we don't know where it is anymore. And there's a legend that says, I think a much older legend that says that stone is the stone of Jacob that he had his dream on. Yeah. Now I don't know about that because that's kind of that's getting into like the Masonic legends, right? And that's not enough to dismiss it because, like, yeah, Masons know some stuff. You know what I mean? So, but I'm just putting that as a disclaimer that this is coming from like Masonic sources, that the stone is the pillar of Jacob. Yeah.
Jesus, that's absolutely fascinating, and we can definitely it's wild that you can really go down the rabbit hole when going into further detail of Brehon law that you really do specialize in. Kevin, thank you so much for today. God, we can end up talking about this pretty much all night. And if anybody has any questions for Kevin, definitely comment below. We plan on doing more videos like this in the future, especially around the politics structure, around conflict, and definitely around religion, ritual, and symbolism. So we definitely want to delve in even deeper into this conversation. So don't worry, Kevin will be jumping over, and myself will be jumping over to Kevin's channel definitely in the future. But other than that, guys, thank you so much. And Kevin, there's a website and stuff you'd like people to jump over to. What's that again?
Yeah, you can check out BrehonAcademy.org. I have plenty of articles over there, and that's where you'll get access to my online courses as well. I'm on YouTube, Brehon Academy. I'm also on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Brehon Academy for all of those channels.
That's nice. Kevin, thank you so much for coming onto the channel today. It means so much to myself. And definitely jump over to Kevin's channel. If you hop over to my channel and go down to the very bottom, you can subscribe to the Brehon Academy. It'll be down below at the bottom of my YouTube channel. Other than that, guys, thank you so much, and 𝐶𝐤𝐵H 𝐻𝐿.